In places like this, you learn fast. There are people who belong and people who were tolerated. She knew which one she was. For 3 weeks, Bryn Castellane had been invisible among the teams, just another civilian contractor nobody noticed. Until the moment a cocky trainee decided to make her the joke of the evening. He tripped her, grabbed her arm, then slapped her face hard enough for the entire mess hall to hear. He laughed, his buddies snickered, and for 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, one by one, every SEAL in that room stood up. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you appreciate stories that honor quiet sacrifice, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. What that trainee didn't know was about to end his career before it even started. Dust swirled across the tarmac outside Naval Amphibious Base Coronado as the late afternoon sun turned the Pacific horizon into molten copper. A canvas bag hit the concrete with a dull thud, and a woman's hand reached down to retrieve it. The hand was unadorned except for a thin silver bracelet that caught the dying light for just a moment, before disappearing back into shadow. The bag was old military surplus, worn at the corners, the kind that had seen a dozen deployments and twice as many owners. It carried the weight of practicality, nothing more. Inside the logistics office, the air conditioning struggled against the California heat. 3 civilian contractors sat at metal desks arranged in a loose triangle, their conversation punctuated by the rhythmic clacking of keyboards and the occasional burst of laughter. They were comfortable here, settled into the rhythm of military adjacency without the burden of service itself. They knew how to navigate the unspoken hierarchies, when to speak and when to fade into the background. Near the window, separate from the easy camaraderie, Bryn Castellane worked in silence. She was 28, but carried herself with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned early that attention was rarely beneficial. Her desk was organized to the point of severity, manifests aligned in the perfect stacks, pens arranged by color, a single coffee mug that never seemed to empty. She wore plain clothes, muted colors that neither offended nor inspired comment. Her hair was pulled back in a functional ponytail. Everything about her presentation suggested someone who had made invisibility an art form. A SEAL operator pushed through the door, his desert boots leaving faint prints on the linoleum. He was broad-shouldered and sunburned, moving with the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly where he belonged. Bryn stood and crossed the small space, holding out a clipboard without preamble. The paper detailed a supply run scheduled for 0600, equipment requisitions that needed signatures, routes that required approval. The operator took it without making eye contact, scanned the information with practiced efficiency, and signed where indicated. He handed it back and left without a word. Bryn returned to her desk as if nothing had happened, because for her, nothing had. This was the 3rd week of her temporary assignment. 3 weeks of existing in the spaces between, of being the person who made things run smoothly precisely because nobody noticed her doing it. The other contractors had tried to include her at first, inviting her to lunch, asking about her background, probing gently for the story everyone seemed to have in this place. She had deflected with the skill of long practice, polite but distant, present but unreachable. Eventually they stopped trying. It was easier that way for everyone. The bracelet on her wrist was silver, tarnished at the edges, despite what looked like regular polishing. It was too large for her, sliding slightly when she moved her hand, the kind of fit that suggested it had been made for someone else. The engraving on its surface was worn smooth in places, letters that had once been sharp, now softened by years of constant contact. She touched it sometimes, without seeming to realize she was doing it, her fingers finding the metal during moments of stress or deep concentration. It was the only piece of jewelry she wore, the only concession to anything personal in her carefully constructed armor of professionalism. Outside, the base hummed with the controlled chaos of military routine. Helicopters lifted off in the distance, their rotors beating the air into submission. Somewhere, a drill instructor was shouting cadence. Trucks rolled past carrying equipment whose purpose was classified or simply unknown. This was a world of hierarchies and protocols, of earned respect and inherited skepticism. Civilians were tolerated here because they served a function, but they were never truly part of the fabric. Bryn understood this better than most. She had grown up adjacent to this world, close enough to understand its rhythms, but always on the outside looking in. The female contractor at the desk nearest the door, A cheerful woman named Rivera, who had been here for 6 months, turned in her chair. She had given up on small talk with Bryn, but still made occasional overtures out of what seemed like genuine kindness. "Hey, Bryn," she said, "we are grabbing drinks after shift at that place near the marina. You should come. It would be good to decompress." Bryn looked up from her screen, her expression carefully neutral. "I am good, thanks," she replied. Her tone was not unkind, but it left no room for negotiation. Rivera shrugged with the easy acceptance of someone who had learned not to take rejection personally. "Suit yourself," she said, and turned back to her conversation. The afternoon crawled toward evening. The quality of light changed, turning golden and then amber as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Bryn finished her current task, cross-referenced 3 different inventory systems, caught a discrepancy that would have delayed an important shipment, and corrected it before anyone else noticed there had been a problem. This was her value, not in being seen but in preventing problems before they required visibility. She was good at her job, in a way that made her nearly invisible, which was exactly how she preferred it. At 1800 hours, the office began to empty. The other contractors logged off their systems, gathered their belongings, made plans for the evening that involved anything other than the base. Bryn stayed at her desk, finishing a report that was not due until the following week. She worked best in the quiet hours when the building settled into itself, when she could focus without the constant awareness of being watched or evaluated, or simply existing in proximity to others. The bracelet caught the light from her desk lamp, and her fingers found it again, tracing the worn engravings without conscious thought. By the time she stood and gathered her things, the sun had fully set. The base had shifted into its evening configuration, lights blazing against the darkness, security heightened, the daytime bustle replaced by a different kind of intensity. She locked her desk out of habit, even though there was nothing in it worth securing. Everything important she kept in her head or in encrypted files that required 3 layers of authorization to access. The bag went over her shoulder, canvas strap settling into the groove it had worn there over weeks of repetition. She left through the back entrance, avoiding the main corridors where people gathered and conversations happened. The mess hall was a low concrete building that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and whatever the kitchen had prepared that day. It sat near the barracks, positioned for maximum efficiency and minimum aesthetics. During peak hours, it was a madhouse, hundreds of bodies moving through in waves. But late evening chow was different, quieter, but somehow more intense. This was when the serious operators came, the ones who trained late or worked odd hours, the ones who treated meals as fuel rather than social events. Bryn knew this because she had made a study of patterns, learning the rhythms of the base the way someone might learn a foreign language, knowing when to appear and when to avoid, when to be seen and when to disappear. She pushed through the heavy doors and was immediately hit by a wall of humid air and noise. The ventilation system fought a losing battle against the California evening and the heat from the kitchen. Metal trays clattered against metal counters. Conversations overlapped into a steady drone, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. The smell was institutional food at its most basic. Protein, starch, vegetables that had been cooked until they surrendered any pretense of individual identity. It was not good, but it was fuel, and fuel was all that mattered here. Bryn moved through the line with efficient economy. Chicken that had been grilled into submission. Rice that was slightly overcooked, but edible. Green beans that had been steamed into pale submission. A bottle of water, because the coffee this late would keep her awake until dawn. She paid with the card clipped to her lanyard and turned to scan the room. The mess hall was perhaps half full. Clusters of SEALs at various tables, some in conversation, others eating in focused silence. She spotted an empty corner near the equipment lockers, a space that offered both isolation and a clear line of sight to the exits. Perfect. She started across the room, tray balanced carefully, eyes down, but peripherally aware of everything around her. This was how she moved through the world, present but not intrusive, visible but not noteworthy. She had perfected this walk over years of practice, the art of being somewhere without actually being there. Most of the room ignored her completely, which was exactly as it should be. She was just another contractor, another piece of the machinery that kept this place running, unremarkable and unmemorable. Near the center of the room, 4 SEAL trainees occupied a table. They were young, probably early 20s, still carrying the mixture of arrogance and insecurity that came with being new to the teams. The loudest of them was a kid named Keller Drummond, broad-shouldered and sun-bleached, with the kind of confidence that had not yet been tested by real consequence. He was holding court, gesturing broadly as he recounted some story about a training exercise. His voice carried over the ambient noise, demanding attention whether anyone wanted to give it or not. "I am telling you," Keller said, his voice pitched to reach beyond his immediate audience, "I was 2 seconds off the time. 2 seconds. Next run, I will smoke it." The guy next to him, a quieter trainee named Parch, gave him a skeptical look, but said nothing. Another trainee, Landis, laughed in the way people do when they are not sure if something is actually funny, but want to be part of the moment. The fourth, Quaid, just focused on his food, his body language suggesting he had heard this story before and found it no more convincing on repetition. Keller was the kind of young operator who had not yet learned the difference between confidence and competence. He was skilled enough to have made it this far, which meant he was better than most, but he had not yet faced the moment that would teach him how much he still had to learn. He was hungry for validation, for the acknowledgement of the more senior operators, for the feeling that he belonged in this world he had fought so hard to enter. And like many people who are hungry for something, he sometimes made poor decisions about how to feed that hunger. Bryn was 10 feet from their table when Keller noticed her. Something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that suggested opportunity had presented itself. He glanced at his buddies, then back at her, calculating. She was focused on not spilling her tray, on navigating the narrow space between tables, on reaching her corner and becoming invisible again. She did not see the calculation happening, did not register the moment when Keller decided that entertaining his friends was more important than basic human decency. "Hey," Keller said, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that was meant to be overheard. "Check this out." Parch looked up, saw what was about to happen, and his expression tightened. "Man, leave it alone," he said quietly. The warning in his voice was clear, but Keller either did not hear it or chose to ignore it. He grinned, the expression of someone who thought he was about to do something clever. "Relax," he said, "just having some fun." His boot slid out into the narrow aisle, positioned exactly where Bryn would step in another 2 seconds. She did not see it. Her focus was on the tray, on the logistics of movement, on the familiar mental checklist that helped her navigate spaces like this. Her foot came down on the edge of his boot, and her balance shifted suddenly. The tray tilted violently to one side. For a fraction of a second she was going to fall, physics and momentum conspiring against her. But muscle memory kicked in, the kind that comes from years of catching yourself, of recovering from stumbles, of maintaining composure when everything wants to fly apart. She caught the tray, pulled it back to center, steadied herself. Rice scattered across the floor in a pale spray. A few grains hit Keller's boot. The sound of plastic hitting tile drew a few glances from nearby tables, but not sustained attention. This was a mess hall. Things got spilled. People moved on. Bryn stood completely still for a moment, processing what had happened, running through the calculations of whether this was an accident or intentional, and if intentional, what the appropriate response would be. Before she could reach a conclusion, Keller was standing. He came up out of his chair with the easy physicality of someone who had spent years in athletic training. He was bigger than her by a significant margin, and he used that size now, positioning himself so that he occupied her space, so that she had to look up to meet his eyes if she chose to meet them at all. "Whoa there, sweetheart," he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "You okay? Maybe you should watch where you are going." A few of the other trainees snickered. The sound was nervous, the laughter of people who were not entirely comfortable but did not want to break ranks. Bryn pulled her arm back from where he had reached out to steady her with a grip that was slightly too firm. "I am fine," she said. Her voice was level, professional, giving nothing away. She set the tray down on the edge of the nearest table and turned to look for napkins to clean up the rice. The interaction should have ended there. A minor incident, quickly resolved, forgotten by morning. But Keller was not done. "You spilled your food," he said, his voice carrying further now, playing to the room. "That is taxpayer money, you know." A few more people glanced over. The attention emboldened him. He was getting the reaction he wanted, the acknowledgement, the sense that he was the center of something. Bryn did not look at him. "I will clean it up," she said quietly. She started toward the napkin dispenser near the beverage station. She had taken perhaps 2 steps when Keller moved. His hand came up fast, not a closed fist, but an open palm, and connected with the side of her face with a sharp crack that echoed in the sudden pocket of silence that had formed around them. It was not hard enough to seriously injure, not hard enough to leave more than a temporary mark, but it was loud, and it was public, and it was meant to humiliate. "Maybe next time you will be more careful, huh?" Keller said, grinning at his buddies like he had just accomplished something worth celebrating. Bryn froze. Her hand came up slowly to touch her cheek, where the skin was already warming from the impact. She did not cry, did not shout, did not react with anger or fear or any of the emotions that might have been expected. She simply stood there for 2 full seconds, her eyes closed, breathing slowly through her nose. Then she opened her eyes, lowered her hand, and bent down to start picking up the rice, 1 grain at a time, methodical and deliberate, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just been struck in front of dozens of witnesses. Keller turned back to his table, his grin widening. "See," he said to Parch and the others. "No big deal." Landis gave a forced laugh that sounded hollow even to him. Quaid would not look up from his tray. Parch stared at Keller with an expression that might have been disgust or might have been fear of what was about to happen. The mess hall began to resume its normal rhythm. Conversations picked back up. Trays clattered. The moment seemed to be passing into the background noise of institutional life. But then something changed. It started at a table near the back, 15 feet from where Bryn knelt on the floor collecting rice. A SEAL operator, perhaps 30 years old with the weathered look of multiple deployments, stopped mid-bite. His fork hung in the air, forgotten. He was staring at Bryn's wrist, at the silver bracelet that had slid down slightly as she reached for scattered grains. His eyes went wide, not with shock exactly, but with recognition. The fork lowered slowly to his tray with exaggerated care. He leaned toward the man next to him, an older operator with gray in his beard, and whispered something. The second man followed the first one's gaze, saw the bracelet, and went completely still. His jaw tightened. He set down his water bottle as if it were made of glass. Then he stood. Just stood up from his seat without explanation or announcement. The man who had first noticed followed a second later. Then someone at the next table, then another. The movement rippled outward like a wave, chairs scraping against tile in a rhythm. That was becoming impossible to ignore. Keller was still grinning, still basking in what he thought was his moment of triumph. Parch was trying to get his attention, his voice low and urgent. Keller?" he said. "What?" Keller replied, still not turning around. Parch did not answer. He just pointed. Keller turned, his grin faltering, confusion replacing confidence as he registered what was happening behind him. One by one, in spreading silence, every SEAL in the mess hall was standing up, not moving toward him, not speaking, just standing. Their eyes were not on Keller. They were looking at Bryn, still kneeling on the floor, still picking up rice as if the entire room had not just shifted around her. The sound of chairs scraping became overwhelming and then stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. 30 men standing in perfect stillness, the kind of silence that has weight and presence. Keller's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His buddies had gone pale. Landis and Quaid were staring at their trays, as if they could will themselves invisible. Parch was looking at Bryn, then at Keller, then back at Bryn, trying to understand what he was seeing. A path opened through the standing SEALs, heavy boots on tile, measured and deliberate. Senior Chief Garrett Falk walked forward from the back of the room where he had been eating alone. He was late 40s, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that gave nothing away until he decided to let it. He moved with the economy of someone who never wasted energy, who understood that real authority did not need to announce itself. He walked past Keller without a glance, as if the trainee did not exist or was not worth acknowledging. The dismissal was more devastating than any confrontation could have been. Falk stopped directly in front of Bryn. She was still crouched, still holding a napkin with a few grains of rice. Her movements frozen now as she registered his presence. The entire room held its breath. Falk looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying in the absolute silence. "Evening, Osprey." The name hung in the air like a detonation. Bryn's hands stopped moving. She stayed perfectly still for 3 seconds that felt like hours. Then slowly, as if moving through water, she stood. "Senior Chief," she said quietly, "you do not have to do this." The words were barely audible, but everyone heard them. Falk's expression did not change. "Yeah," he said. "I do. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for what is right when no one else would? If this story speaks to you, I would be honored if you took a moment to subscribe and join us in honoring those who serve with quiet dignity." The silence in the mess hall was not empty. It had texture and weight, pressing down on everyone present like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Keller Drummond stood frozen near his table, his earlier confidence evaporating as he tried to understand what was happening. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for an explanation, finding only stone expressions and eyes that would not meet his. Senior Chief Garrett Falk stood in front of Bryn Castellane, his presence filling the space between them with an authority that needed no announcement. Bryn remained motionless, the napkin with rice still clutched in her hand. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her shoulders drawn in slightly, as if she were trying to make herself smaller. The bracelet on her wrist caught the fluorescent light, silver against her skin. And for the first time that evening, multiple people in the room were looking at it with recognition. Falk reached out slowly, his movement telegraphed and careful, and gently lifted her wrist so the bracelet was visible to those nearby. He did not speak yet. He did not need to. The engraving on the bracelet was worn, but still legible to anyone who looked closely. Letters that had been sharp once, now softened by years of constant contact, spelled out a name and a date and a designation that meant nothing to Keller but everything to the men standing in silence around him. Falk held Bryn's wrist steady for 3 seconds, long enough for the message to register, then released it carefully. She pulled her hand back and wrapped her fingers around the bracelet protectively, as if trying to shield it from the attention. "That is Lyra's kid," someone said from the back of the room. The voice was quiet, but it carried in the silence. A ripple went through the assembled seals, not movement exactly, but a shift in energy, recognition spreading like current through water. Another voice, older and rougher, added a single word that fell like a stone into still water. Jalalabad. The word hung there, heavy with implication, and suddenly the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees despite the humid evening heat. Keller's face had gone pale. He looked at Quaid, desperation creeping into his expression. "Who?" he started to ask, but his voice cracked and he had to clear his throat. "Who is Lyra Castellane?" The question was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute quiet it might as well have been shouted. Quaid finally looked up from his tray, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something close to pity. "You don't know," he said flatly. It was not a question. Keller shook his head, the motion jerky and uncertain. Quaid glanced at the standing seals, then back at Keller. "Google Jalalabad rescue," he said quietly. "Then look at what you just did." Parch had pushed his chair back from the table, putting distance between himself and Keller without actually standing. His hands were flat on the table, his knuckles white from pressure. Landis was staring at his tray as if it held answers, his breathing shallow and rapid. The three of them were realizing simultaneously that they had been sitting at ground zero of something catastrophic, and they had not understood until it was far too late. The social calculus of the teams was brutal and unforgiving. Association mattered, proximity mattered. Right now, they were all dangerously close to Keller, and that proximity was marking them. Falk had not moved from his position in front of Bryn. He stood with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and the authority to use it however he saw fit. Finally he spoke, his voice pitched low, but somehow filling the entire space. "March 17th, 2019, he said. "Jalalabad Province, Afghanistan." The words were simple and factual, but they landed with the force of revelation. Several of the standing seals shifted their weight. One man near the back put his hand over his mouth. Another looked away, blinking rapidly. The room waited. Keller tried to make himself smaller, to somehow reverse what he had done through sheer force of will. It did not work. Physics and consequence were not subject to regret. Falk continued, his tone still level and controlled, the voice of someone recounting facts that could not be disputed. 6-man SEAL element, he said. Recon operation that went sideways. Ambush during exfil, pinned down in a compound with no clear route to extraction. 3 men wounded, ammunition running low, enemy closing in from multiple directions. The details were clinical, but the weight behind them was enormous. This was not a story being told for entertainment. This was testimony. This was history being entered into the record so that someone who had not been there could understand the magnitude of what had happened. Falk's eyes never left Bryn, who stood perfectly still, her jaw tight, her breathing controlled. She knew this story. She had lived with it for 6 years. Hearing it recounted in front of dozens of people was clearly costing her something, but she gave no outward sign beyond the tension in her shoulders. Primary extraction bird took RPG fire on approach, Falk continued. Pilot aborted. Secondary LZ was too far. The element was looking at capture or death. Standard protocol would have been to scrub the mission and try again when conditions improved. But standard protocol required time these men did not have. Falk paused, letting the implications settle. The compound they were in had been marked by enemy forces. Air support was minutes away, but minutes might as well have been hours. They needed someone willing to ignore the risk. They needed someone willing to fly into a kill zone because it was the right thing to do. A Marine CH-53 was operating in the area, Falk said. Pilot received the abort order and acknowledged. Then she turned her bird around and headed straight into the hot zone anyway. Her co-pilot bailed, radioed that the mission was suicide and refused to participate. The pilot told him to get out and went in alone. She set down 50 meters from the compound under sustained fire, took multiple hits to the airframe, and then did something nobody expected. She left the cockpit. The room was absolutely silent now. Even the ambient sounds of the base outside seemed to have faded away. Falk's voice was the only thing that existed. She ran into that compound, he said, pulled wounded SEALs to their feet, physically helped carry them to the bird. Rounds were hitting all around her. She took shrapnel in her leg and kept moving, got all 6 men aboard, got back to the cockpit, and lifted off while the bird was still taking fire. Everyone in this room who knows anything about combat aviation will tell you that landing was impossible. Taking off again was worse. She did it anyway. Bryn's hand had found the bracelet again, her fingers moving over the engraving in small, repetitive motions. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing carefully measured. Falk noticed but did not stop. This was not cruelty. This was honoring a debt that could never truly be repaid. He turned slightly, addressing the room more broadly now, but keeping Bryn in his peripheral vision. The bird cleared the compound and gained altitude, he said. For approximately 90 seconds, it looked like everyone was going to make it. Then an RPG hit the tail rotor. Someone in the back of the room made a sound, something between a cough and a curse, quickly suppressed. The details of what happened next were clearly known to many of the men present, but hearing them recounted brought the reality back with visceral force. The helicopter went into an uncontrolled spin, Falk continued. Standard procedure would have been to attempt an emergency landing as close to friendly forces as possible. Instead, the pilot fought the controls and steered away from the SEAL element's last known position. She put the bird down 400 meters out, into enemy territory, to keep the crash site separated from the men she had just rescued. The crash killed her, someone said from the assembled SEALs. The voice belonged to Chief Warrant Officer Merrick Thane, a man in his mid-30s with scars visible on his forearms, and a stillness that suggested he had seen things that never left you. He stepped forward now, moving to stand beside Falk, his eyes on Bryn. QRF reached the crash site 20 minutes later, he said. She had survived the impact, but not long enough for them to extract her. She died protecting men she had never met, because it was her job and because it was right. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a current of emotion held in check through discipline and will. Tane turned to look at Keller directly for the first time. I was one of the 6, he said. The words were simple, but they reconfigured everything. This was not a story being told secondhand. This was not history filtered through reports and debriefs. This was a man standing in front of them, saying I was there, and I would have died, if not for her. The weight of that testimony was crushing. Keller's knees seemed to buckle slightly, and he caught himself on the edge of the table, his face ashen. 2 others in this room were on that bird. Thane continued. He gestured without looking, and 2 SEALs raised their hands briefly before lowering them. They did not step forward. They did not need to. The acknowledgement was enough. 3 survivors present in a room of 30 meant that 1 in 10 of the men standing here owed their lives directly to the woman whose daughter Keller had just struck. The math was brutal and inescapable. The invisible network of loyalty and debt that held the teams together had just been made visible, and Keller was on the wrong side of every line. Falk picked up the narrative again, his voice returning to that same measured cadence. Captain Lyra Castellane was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, he said. The citation reads in part that she displayed extraordinary heroism and disregard for her own safety in the face of overwhelming enemy fire. It notes that her actions directly resulted in the survival of 6 naval special warfare operators who would otherwise have been killed or captured. It does not mention that she was a single mother. It does not mention that she had been advised 3 times not to attempt the extraction. It does not mention that she knew exactly what she was risking and did it anyway. Bryn opened her eyes. They were dry, but rimmed with red, the only visible sign of the effort it was taking to remain composed. "Senior Chief," she said quietly, "you don't need to do this." Her voice was steady but small, almost swallowed by the space around her. Falk turned back to her, and for the first time his expression softened slightly, though not in a way that made him seem any less formidable. "Yeah," he said, "I do. Because you won't. Because you have been here 3 weeks and have not once mentioned who you are or what your mother did. Because you work harder than anyone, stay later than anyone, and ask for nothing. That is why we do this." "The bracelet," Tane said, and all eyes went back to Bryn's wrist. "She wore that in the cockpit," he continued. "We recovered it from the crash site. The engraving was her call sign, her unit, and the date she knew she might not come home. She had it made after her husband died, before Bryn was born. Wore it every flight. We gave it to Bryn at the memorial service because it was the only thing that survived intact, and because it seemed right that she should have something her mother carried into combat. The details were piling up, each one adding weight to the crushing realization of what Keller had done. This was not just a contractor. This was not just a civilian who happened to work on base. This was legacy. This was family. This was someone who carried the memory of sacrifice in a way that transcended rank or position or any formal designation. The men standing in silence were not defending Bryn Castellane the person, though many of them respected her work. They were honoring Lyra Castellane the pilot, the Marine, the woman who had saved their brothers and paid with her life. Keller seemed to understand this, finally. The full scope of his mistake crashed over him like a physical force, and his legs gave out completely. He collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands, his breathing ragged. Parch, Landis, and Quaid were already moving, gathering their trays, putting distance between themselves and the center of the disaster. Their loyalty, such as it was, had limits, and those limits had just been reached. They would not openly condemn Keller, but they would not stand with him either. In the teams, that distinction meant everything. Falk waited until the 3 trainees had moved to another table before speaking again. "Here is what happens now," he said, and his voice had shifted into something harder, the tone of someone delivering a verdict that could not be appealed. "You finish your training. You might even graduate, though I would not bet on it. The instructors will hear about this. Everyone will hear about this. And even if you somehow make it through, you will never be one of us. Every team you try to join will know what you did. Every operator you serve with will know why you are not invited to anything that matters. The punishment was not physical. It was something far worse. It was exclusion. In a community built entirely on trust and brotherhood, on knowing that the person next to you would die before letting you down, being marked as untrustworthy was a death sentence to any real career. Keller could wear the trident. He could have the title, but he would never have the acceptance that made any of it meaningful. He would exist in a permanent state of isolation, surrounded by people who would work with him professionally, but never truly include him. "You won't be hazed," Falk continued. "You won't be physically harmed. You will just be nothing, invisible, and every day you will know exactly why." Tane stepped closer to Keller's table and placed something on the surface. It was a small patch, an American flag in subdued colors worn at the edges. "This was from her uniform," he said. "We all carry one. A piece of who she was and what she did. You don't get one. You will never get one. That is your consequence." The room remained standing. Falk turned back to Bryn, who had set down the napkin and was standing with her arms wrapped around herself, a posture of self-protection that looked foreign on someone who usually carried herself with such careful neutrality. "You good?" he asked quietly. She nodded once, not trusting her voice. "I am always good, Senior Chief," she said finally. Falk's expression suggested he did not believe her, but he respected the answer. I know you are, he replied. Then he stepped back, creating space for her to leave if she chose to. Bryn bent down and picked up her tray. The food was cold now, the rice scattered and partially collected, the meal ruined in every practical sense. She did not seem to care. She walked toward the exit with the same measured pace she had used entering, head down, shoulders slightly hunched. The path, cleared for her automatically. As she passed each table, Seals remained standing until she was past, a ripple of respect following her progress across the room. She did not acknowledge it. She did not look at anyone. She just walked. When she reached the door and pushed through into the evening air, the spell broke slightly. The assembled Seals began to sit, the movement gradual and reluctant, as if standing had become the only appropriate posture and sitting was a concession to practicality rather than desire. Conversations did not resume. People returned to their food, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. What had been a space of casual camaraderie had become something else, a courtroom or memorial service, someplace where normal rules did not apply. Keller remained at his table, alone now in every sense that mattered. His tray sat in front of him, untouched. His hands were shaking slightly, a fine tremor that he could not control. Around him, the normal sounds of the mess hall were beginning to return, but they seemed to flow around him rather than including him, as if he existed in a bubble of silence that moved with him. One Seal walked past his table, paused, then deliberately picked up the flag patch Tane had placed there and took it with him. The gesture was casual, but its meaning was absolute. Falk remained standing longer than the others, his eyes on the door Bryn had exited through. One of the younger Seals approached him, someone who had been sitting too far away to hear all the details, but had seen the entire confrontation unfold. Senior Chief, the younger man said quietly, is she really okay? Falk considered the question, his expression thoughtful. She has been not okay for 6 years, he replied, but she keeps moving forward. That is more strength than most people will ever have. The younger Seal nodded and returned to his table. Outside, the evening had fully settled into night. The base lights created pools of illumination, separated by stretches of darkness. Bryn walked away from the mess hall without any clear destination, just movement for its own sake, putting distance between herself and what had just happened. She found a bench near the perimeter fence where the ocean was visible in the distance, dark water under darker sky, and sat down heavily. The bracelet caught the light from a nearby lamppost, and she looked at it for a long time. The engraving was almost illegible now from years of handling, but she did not need to read it to know what it said. Captain Lyra Castellane, VMFA 314, KIA 03 2019. Her mother's name, unit, and the date that had divided Bryn's life into before and after. She had been 11 when the two Marines in dress uniforms had knocked on their door, old enough to understand what their presence meant, too young to process the full scope of what had been taken. Her mother had been her entire world, fierce and funny and impossibly brave, someone who made everything seem possible even when logic said otherwise. The years since had been an exercise in learning to exist with absence. At first there had been the practical considerations, the sudden need to figure out where to live and who would take care of her, and how to navigate systems designed for families with 2 parents, or at least one living one. Her mother's parents had stepped in, good people who did their best but could never fill the specific void Lyra had left. Then there had been the ceremonies and the medals and the endless well-meaning people telling her that her mother was a hero, as if that was supposed to make losing her easier. She had learned to smile and say thank you, and not scream that she did not want a hero. She wanted her mother, had learned to wear the grief privately, to function in public, to build a life around the whole rather than falling into it. School, then community college, then work in logistics because she was good, with systems and details, and because it kept her mind occupied. The military had always been in the background of her life, not as a career path, but as context, the world her mother had inhabited and ultimately died serving. When the opportunity to work as a contractor on base had come up, she had taken it with mixed feelings. Part of her wanted to be close to that world, to understand what her mother had been part of, to feel connected to something larger. Another part knew it would be complicated, that proximity would bring up things she had worked hard to manage. She had told herself she would keep her head down, do the work, and not draw attention. For 3 weeks that plan had worked perfectly. Then Keller Drummond had kicked her in front of 30 witnesses, and everything had come apart. Footsteps approached from behind, measured and unhurried. She did not turn around. She knew the gate, had cataloged it along with dozens of others during her time here. Falk came around the bench and stood at a respectful distance, not sitting, giving her space to tell him to leave if she wanted. "You could have said something," he offered after a moment. "Could have told people who you were, saved yourself a lot of trouble." Bryn shook her head slightly. "I don't trade on her name," she said. "Never have. She did what she did because it was right, not so I could have an easier time 20 years later." Falk nodded slowly. "We know," he said. "That is exactly why we protect it. Because you don't ask, because you don't use it, because you work twice as hard as anyone else and never mention what you carry. That kind of integrity is rare." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your mother saved Thane and 2 others in this room, saved 3 more who have since transferred or retired. Every single one of them has told the story to someone else. That debt does not disappear, it gets handed down. We stand for you because standing for you is standing for her, and we owe her everything." The logic was sound, but it did not make the attention any easier to bear. Bryn had spent years trying to be separate from her mother's legacy, to be her own person with her own accomplishments that had nothing to do with heroism or sacrifice, or any of the heavy words that surrounded military service. She had wanted to be invisible here precisely because being visible meant being defined by something she had not chosen and could never change. Now that invisibility was gone, and she did not know how to get it back. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Falk considered the question. "Tomorrow you come to work like always," he said. "People will know, some will treat you differently, more careful, more respectful. You can't control that, but you can control how you respond. Keep doing what you have been doing. Good work, no drama, head down. Eventually it will settle, not back to how it was, but to something manageable. As for Keller," he paused, "that is already handled. He won't bother you again. No, one will." Bryn wanted to believe that, wanted to think that this incident would fade into background noise and life would continue. But she knew better. She had seen how the teams operated, how stories became legend, how single moments could define entire careers. What had happened tonight in the mess hall would be told and retold, details added and subtracted, until it became something both more and less than what actually occurred. She would be at the center of that story, whether she wanted to be or not. "Do you think she would be proud?" Bryn asked suddenly. The question seemed to surprise Falk, but he recovered quickly. "Of what?" he asked. "Of me," Bryn clarified. "Working logistics, staying out of sight, not doing anything important." The self-judgment in her voice was clear and painful. Falk sat down on the bench finally, leaving space between them, but closing the distance enough to make the conversation feel less formal. "Your mother named you Osprey too before you could walk," he said. "Told everyone you would carry the call sign when you were ready. You think she did that because she wanted you to be a pilot." Bryn had never heard that detail before. Her grandparents had told her stories about her mother, but never that one. She did not know what to do with the information. Falk continued, his voice thoughtful. "She named you that because ospreys are survivors. They adapt. They find ways to thrive in difficult environments. They take care of their young and they don't give up. That is what she saw in you, even when you were tiny. That is what she wanted you to be. Not a hero, just someone who survived and found their own path." The words settled over Bryn like a weight lifting rather than descending. She had spent so long thinking she was disappointing some unspoken expectation, falling short of a standard she could never meet. The idea that her mother had wanted something different, something simpler and more human, shifted her entire understanding of the legacy she carried. Maybe her mother had not wanted her to be extraordinary. Maybe she had just wanted her to be okay. Inside the mess hall, the evening was winding down. SEALs finished their meals and cleared their trays, conversations happening in low tones, the earlier tension not forgotten, but settling into something that could be lived with. Keller's table remained empty, his tray abandoned where he had left it. Eventually, a staff member came by and cleared it, the meal dumped into trash, the tray returned to the stack. The chair stayed empty. No. One sat there for the rest of the night. Parch, Landis, and Quaid sat at a table on the far side of the room. not talking much, all three of them processing what had happened and what it meant for their association with Keller. They had not done anything wrong directly, but proximity was its own kind of guilt in a community this tightly bound. They would need to make clear in the coming days that they had tried to stop him, that they had not supported what he did, that they understood the magnitude of the offense. It would take time and careful navigation, but it was possible they could recover. Keller's recovery was far less certain. Tain sat with two other survivors of Jalalabad, men who had been there that day in 2019 and carried the memory like scar tissue. They did not need to discuss what had happened. They had all seen Bryn around the base during her 3 weeks here, had all recognized her from photos Lyra had carried, had all made the choice independently to let her be invisible if that was what she wanted. Tonight had taken that choice away, and they were working through the implications. One of them, a quiet operator named Goran, finally spoke. "She is going to have a harder time now," he said, "being known." The others nodded. They would watch out for her without being obvious about it. They would make sure she had space when she needed it, and backup when she did not. Falk eventually stood from the bench, his knees protesting slightly. "I have to get back," he said, "but you know where to find me if you need anything." "Anything at all." Bryn nodded, still looking out at the dark ocean. "Thank you, Senior Chief," she said, "for what you did in there, for what you said." Falk shrugged slightly. "Just telling the truth," he replied. "Your mother earned what we give you. We are just paying the debt forward." He walked away, boots crunching on gravel, leaving her alone with the sound of waves and the weight of a legacy she had never asked for but could not escape. The night deepened. Bryn sat on the bench for another 20 minutes, running through scenarios in her mind, trying to find a path forward that felt manageable. Eventually, she stood and walked back toward the logistics office. Her bag was still there, locked in her desk, and she had work to finish before morning. The routine would help. The structure would give her something to hold on to, while everything else felt uncertain. She unlocked the office and turned on the lights. The space was exactly as she had left it, neat and organized and empty. She sat at her desk and pulled up the reports she had been working on earlier. The numbers made sense in a way that human interactions rarely did. Inventory could be counted. Shipments could be tracked. Problems could be solved with logic and procedure. She lost herself in the work, letting it fill the space in her mind that wanted to replay the mess hall scene endlessly. Hours passed. At some point she looked up and realized it was past midnight. The base had gone quiet outside, only essential personnel moving around, the daytime energy replaced by the focused intensity of night operations. She saved her work and shut down her computer. The bag went over her shoulder, the canvas strap finding its familiar groove. She left through the back entrance again, locking the door behind her. The walk back to her temporary housing was short, but she took the long way, needing movement and air, and the sense that she had some control over where she went and how she got there. The bracelet was cool against her skin, despite the warm night. She touched it once, feeling the worn engraving, then dropped her hand. Tomorrow would come, whether she was ready or not. People would know. Things would change. She would adapt, because that was what ospreys did. They survived. They found a way. Her mother had named her well. If someone you know has ever carried a burden in silence, honor them by sharing their story when the time is right. If this resonates with you, subscribing would mean the world and helps us continue sharing stories that matter. Morning came to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado with the same relentless efficiency it always did. The sun broke over the eastern hills, turning the Pacific from black to gray to blue in gradual stages. Helicopters lifted off from the airfield, their rotors cutting the air into rhythmic pulses that carried across the entire installation. The base woke in layers, early risers first, then the bulk of personnel, finally the stragglers who had worked late or slept poorly. Bryn Castellane was in the first category, awake before dawn, dressed and ready before most people had opened their eyes. She stood in front of the small mirror in her temporary quarters and examined her reflection with clinical detachment. The side of her face where Keller had struck her showed no visible mark. The impact had been calculated for humiliation rather than injury, a fact that somehow made it worse. She touched the spot briefly, feeling nothing beyond residual sensitivity, then dropped her hand. The bracelet slid down her wrist slightly and she adjusted it, centering the worn engraving against her pulse point. The silver was cool against her skin, despite the warmth already building in the room. The walk to the logistics office took 8 minutes. She timed it unconsciously, her internal clock tracking movement and distance out of habit. The base was quiet at this hour, only essential personnel visible, moving with purpose toward their assigned tasks. A few people glanced at her as she passed, but no one stopped or spoke. She could not tell if that was normal morning protocol or something else, awareness spreading faster than she had anticipated. Either way, she kept her pace steady and her expression neutral, giving nothing away. The office was empty when she arrived. She unlocked the door and disabled the alarm system, movements automatic from repetition. The lights flickered on with a faint electrical hum. Everything was exactly as she had left it hours before, her desk organized, her computer locked, the reports she had been working on saved and ready for review. She sat down and booted up her system, watching the login screen materialize while her mind ran through the day's priorities. Supply manifest review, equipment requisition approvals, coordination with 3 different departments on overlapping shipments. Standard work, manageable work, work that would keep her occupied and useful and not thinking about last night. The other contractors arrived within the next hour. Rivera came in first, carrying coffee and a breakfast sandwich wrapped in foil. She paused when she saw Bryn already at her desk, surprise flickering across her face before being replaced with something more careful. "Morning," she said, her tone neutral but slightly off, as if she were testing the temperature of water before committing to diving in. Bryn looked up and nodded. "Morning," she replied, then returned her attention to her screen. The dismissal was polite but absolute. Rivera hesitated for another second, then moved to her own desk without further comment. 2 more contractors filtered in over the next 20 minutes. Both glanced at Bryn with expressions that suggested they had heard something, but were not sure what to do with the information. The office settled into its normal rhythm, keyboards clicking, phones ringing occasionally, the low murmur of professional conversation. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged. Underneath, the dynamics had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Bryn could feel the difference even if she could not articulate it precisely. She was no longer invisible. She was being carefully not looked at, which was an entirely different state of being. At 0830, a SEAL operator pushed through the door, carrying a standard equipment request form. He was someone Bryn had interacted with multiple times over the past 3 weeks. A quiet professional who treated everyone with the same distant courtesy. He walked directly to her desk and set down the form, waiting while she reviewed it. Everything looked correct. She signed where indicated and handed it back. The operator took it, made eye contact for the first time in their entire working relationship, and nodded once. The gesture was small but deliberate, acknowledgement rather than greeting. "Ma'am," he said quietly before turning to leave. The single word hung in the air after he was gone. Rivera was watching from her desk across the room. When the door closed, she turned to Bryn with poorly concealed curiosity. "Did something happen?" she asked carefully. "I have been getting weird vibes all morning. People being extra polite." Bryn kept her eyes on her screen, her fingers continuing to type. "Nothing that concerns logistics," she said evenly. "Just a misunderstanding that got cleared up." The deflection was smooth, but it did not satisfy Rivera's curiosity. She opened her mouth to ask another question, thought better of it, and returned to her own work. The subject was closed for now, but Bryn knew it would not stay that way. Information moved through communities like water finding cracks. Eventually, the full story would reach everyone who cared to listen. The morning progressed in fits and starts, periods of focused work interrupted by small incidents that felt significant even when they were objectively minor. A supply sergeant who normally dropped off paperwork with minimal interaction spent an extra minute explaining a complicated requisition, his tone more respectful than strictly necessary. A junior officer who had never acknowledged Bryn's existence paused at her desk to ask if she needed anything. The question general, but the intent specific. Each interaction was professional and appropriate. None of them were normal. The cumulative effect was exhausting in ways that actual work never was. By mid-morning, Bryn had processed 17 requisition forms, updated 4 different inventory databases, and coordinated delivery schedules with 2 separate transport units. The work was mechanical but satisfying, problems with clear solutions and outcomes that could be measured objectively. She preferred this kind of challenge to the ambiguous social navigation that had dominated the past 12 hours. Numbers did not carry judgment or expectation. Systems followed logic rather than emotion. She could lose herself in the structure and emerge on the other side having accomplished something concrete. At 1000 hours, Senior Chief Falk appeared in the doorway. He did not enter immediately, just stood there surveying the office until his eyes found Bryn. She felt his presence before she looked up. Some instinct developed over years of being aware of her surroundings, alerting her to observation. When she met his gaze, he gestured slightly with his head toward the hallway. The message was clear. She saved her work, stood, and followed him out without explanation to the other contractors. They walked down the corridor in silence until they reached a small conference room that was currently unoccupied. Falk held the door and waited for her to enter, then closed it behind them. The room was windowless and functional, dominated by a table surrounded by uncomfortable chairs. He did not sit, and neither did she. "Just wanted to check in," he said without preamble. "Make sure you are holding up after last night. How are things going?" Bryn considered her answer carefully. "Fine," she said. "Work is normal. People are being polite. I am adjusting." Falk studied her face for a long moment, reading things she had not said. "Being polite is not the same as being normal," he observed. "You know that is going to continue for a while. People process information at different speeds. Some will treat you differently permanently. You prepared for that." The question was genuine, not rhetorical. "I don't know," Bryn admitted. "I came here to work, not to be known, not to represent anything." Falk nodded slowly. "I understand that," he said. "But you don't get to choose what other people see when they look at you. Your mother made a choice that saved lives. Those lives belong to people who have families and friends and teammates. The ripples from her decision are still spreading. You are part of those ripples whether you want to be or not." His tone was not unkind, but it was direct, offering no false comfort or easy solutions. "What happened to Keller?" Bryn asked, changing the subject slightly. Falk's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "He is still in training, technically," he said. "But he has been moved to a different rotation, and his instructors have been briefed on the situation. He won't wash out because of this incident alone, not officially. But his evaluations will be thorough, and his margins for error are now essentially zero. And even if he graduates, every team he applies to will receive a full report on his conduct. His reputation preceded him before he really had one." "That seems harsh," Bryn said quietly. Falk shook his head. "Harsh would be ending his career immediately for a single mistake," he replied. "This is accountability. He demonstrated poor judgment and a fundamental misunderstanding of the values that hold the teams together. Those are character issues that training can address but cannot fix if the individual does not understand why they matter. We are giving him the opportunity to prove he can learn and change. Most people in his position would not get that chance." The explanation made sense within the logic of military culture, even if it still felt complicated to Bryn. She had not wanted anyone punished severely. She had just wanted to be left alone. But the machinery of consequence had engaged, and there was no reversing it now. Falk seemed to read her thoughts. "This is not about revenge," he said. "It is about maintaining standards. If we let that kind of behavior slide, even once, it erodes everything we have built. The teams function on trust. You can't trust someone who thinks humiliating others is acceptable entertainment. It is that simple." Bryn nodded slowly, accepting the reality if not entirely comfortable with it. "Is there anything else I should know?" she asked. "Anything I should be prepared for?" Falk considered the question. "Tane and a few others who were on that bird might reach out," he said. "They are protective of your mother's memory, and by extension, protective of you. Let them help if you need it, but don't feel obligated to accept every offer. You get to set your own boundaries. Also," he paused, "some people might ask you about that day, about your mother. You don't owe anyone those stories. What you choose to share is entirely up to you." The permission to refuse felt important. Bryn had worried that being known would mean being expected to perform grief or gratitude on demand, to be a living memorial rather than a person. Falk was explicitly telling her that was not required. "Thank you," she said, "for last night and for this conversation, for making sure I understood what was happening." Falk waved off the gratitude. "Just doing what is right," he said. "Your mother did that for us. We do it for you. Simple equation." He opened the door and gestured for her to precede him back into the hallway. They walked back toward the logistics office in companionable silence. As they approached the door, Falk spoke one more time. "You are going to be okay," he said. "Not because of anything we do, but because you are capable and strong and you know how to adapt. Your mother knew that about you before you were old enough to know it about yourself. That is why she gave you that call sign. Ospreys survive." He nodded once and walked away, leaving Bryn standing in the hallway, processing the weight of his words. At 1100 hours, Bryn stood and announced she was taking lunch. She grabbed her bag and left, before anyone could offer to join her. The mess hall felt like hostile territory now, the site of last night's confrontation. But her options were limited, and she refused to let fear dictate her movements. She would go, get food, eat efficiently, and return to work. Simple and straightforward. She pushed through the doors expecting the worst and found something unexpectedly different. The lunch crowd was significant but not overwhelming. Seals occupied most of the tables, some in small groups, others eating alone with the focus of people who viewed meals as fuel rather than social events. Bryn moved through the line, selected food without really registering what she was taking, and paid at the register. Then she turned to find a seat and discovered that a table near the window, one that had been empty when she entered, now had a single occupant. Chief Warrant Officer Merrick Thane sat with his back to the wall, a position that allowed him to see the entire room. He was reading something on a tablet, his tray in front of him barely touched. The seat across from him was conspicuously empty. Bryn considered her options. She could find another table, stake out her own corner, maintain the isolation she had cultivated so carefully. Or she could accept what was clearly an invitation, though it had been offered without words or explicit acknowledgement. She crossed the room and stopped beside the empty chair. "Mind if I sit?" she asked quietly. Tane looked up from his tablet and gestured to the chair without smiling. "It is a free country," he said. The tone was neutral, but not unfriendly. Bryn sat and arranged her tray, hyper-aware of the room around her, but trying not to show it. They ate in silence for several minutes. It was not uncomfortable exactly, but it carried weight, the presence of things unsaid, but mutually understood. Finally, Thane set down his fork and leaned back slightly. "How are you holding up?" he asked. The question was direct, no preamble or small talk to soften it. Bryn appreciated that more than he probably realized. "I am fine," she said. "Just ready for things to go back to normal." Tane nodded slowly. "That is not going to happen," he said, not unkindly. "Not the way you want it to. People know now. You can't unknow something like that." The honesty was brutal, but Bryn preferred it to false reassurance. "So, what do I do?" she asked. Tane considered the question while he took a drink of water. "You keep doing what you have been doing," he said. "Good work, no complaints, head down when you need to, head up when you don't. The teams respect competence and they respect integrity. You have both. The rest will sort itself out." He paused, then added, "And you accept that some people are going to treat you differently. Not worse, just different. Because to them, you represent something bigger than yourself." That was the part Bryn struggled with most. She did not want to be a symbol or a memorial or a living reminder of sacrifice. She wanted to be herself, separate from her mother's legacy, defined by her own choices and actions. But Thane was right. That option had been taken away the moment Falk had said her mother's call sign in front of 30 witnesses. She would always be Lyra Castellane's daughter now, in this place, among these people. The only question was whether she could find a way to live with that reality. "Can I ask you something?" Bryn said after another stretch of silence. Tane nodded. "What was she like?" Bryn asked quietly. "My mother? When you knew her. I was so young when she died. I have memories, but they feel incomplete. Like I am remembering the idea of her rather than the actual person." Toyne set down his water bottle carefully, his expression becoming distant as he accessed memories that were clearly still vivid despite the years. "She was funny," he said finally. "That is the first thing people forget when they talk about heroes. They make them serious and noble and perfect. Your mother was absolutely those things when it mattered, but she was also someone who laughed easily and made terrible jokes and sang off-key in the cockpit." His mouth quirked slightly at the memory. "She was flying us to an insertion point once, and she started singing this old country song, completely butchering the lyrics. One of our guys asked her to stop, and she just sang louder, said if we didn't like it, we could walk. Bryn smiled despite herself. That sounded like the fragments she remembered, the mother who had made everyday things feel lighter somehow. What else? She asked, hungry for details that could fill in the gaps in her incomplete memories. Tane thought for a moment. She was professional, he continued. Never let her personal life interfere with the mission. But she also made sure people knew she had a kid, talked about you all the time, carried that photo in her cockpit, the one of you at the beach holding that ridiculous stuffed dolphin. She was proud of you, made sure everyone knew it. The detail about the photo hit Bryn harder than she expected. She remembered that day at the beach, remembered the dolphin she had won at some boardwalk game, and carried around for months afterward. She had not known her mother had kept a photo from that day, had not realized it had been important enough to bring into combat. The knowledge settled into her chest, heavy and warm simultaneously. Did she ever talk about being scared? Bryn asked. About not coming home. Tane's expression became more serious. Everyone was scared, he said. Anyone who tells you they were not is either lying or too stupid to survive long in that environment. But your mother never let fear control her decisions. She assessed risks, made calculations, and then committed fully to whatever course of action she chose. On that last flight, he paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. She knew what she was doing, knew the odds were not good, but she also knew that 6 men would die if she did not act. For her, that was not really a choice. It was just the obvious next step. The logic was both comforting and devastating. Her mother had not died randomly or senselessly. She had made a decision with full knowledge of the cost and chosen to pay it anyway. There was honor in that, but also an enormous weight. Bryn took a slow breath, processing the information. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "It helps to know more about who she actually was rather than just the stories." Tane nodded. "Anytime you want to know something, ask," he said. "There are at least a dozen people on this base who knew her and would be happy to share, myself included." They finished their meal in more comfortable silence. As Bryn stood to clear her tray, Tane spoke one more time. "She would be proud of you," he said. "Not because of anything specific you have done, but because you are exactly the kind of person she hoped you would become. Strong, competent, unwilling to use her sacrifice as leverage. That integrity matters." Bryn nodded, not trusting her voice, and walked away carrying the words like a gift she had not known she needed. The afternoon was a blur of routine tasks punctuated by continued small interactions that reinforced the morning's pattern. People were more careful around her, more respectful, more aware. By 1500 hours, she was exhausted from the effort of maintaining normalcy in circumstances that were anything but. She finished the last urgent task on her list, locked her desk, and left the office without explanation. Rivera watched her go with an expression of confused concern, but did not follow. Bryn found herself walking toward the base memorial without consciously deciding to go there. Her feet carried her along familiar paths, past buildings and training facilities, through sections of the base she had only seen from a distance. The memorial was a quiet space, deliberately separated from the operational areas, designed for reflection rather than efficiency. It consisted of a low wall made of polished stone, engraved with names and dates and units, surrounded by carefully maintained grass and a few benches positioned for contemplation. She had been here once before, during her first week on base, driven by curiosity and a need to see her mother's name in this context. It had been overwhelming then, seeing Lyra Castellane listed among dozens of other fallen service members, reduced to letters carved in stone. She had not stayed long. Now she approached the wall again, moving slowly, reading names she did not recognize, dates that marked the end of lives and the beginning of absences. Halfway down the second panel, she found her mother's entry. Captain Lyra Castellane, VMFA 314, KIA 03.17/2019. The letters were clean and precise, giving no hint of the chaos and violence that had preceded them. Bryn stood in front of the name for a long time, not thinking anything specific, just existing in proximity to this marker of loss. The bracelet on her wrist felt heavier than usual, as if the silver had absorbed weight from the air. She touched it once, then reached out and placed her palm flat against the stone, feeling the coolness of the engraved surface. The gesture felt inadequate, but she did not know what else to do. How did you talk to someone who existed now, only in memory and official records and the stories other people told? I don't know what I am supposed to do with this, she said quietly to the wall, to her mother, to whoever might be listening. You made a choice, and it was the right choice, and now I carry the weight of that choice everywhere I go. People look at me and see you. They treat me with respect I have not earned because of something you did. I don't know how to be worthy of that. I don't know how to be anyone's daughter when you are not here to show me what that means. The words came easier than she expected, years of unspoken thoughts finally finding voice. I tried to be invisible, she continued. Tried to build a life that was just mine, not connected to heroism or sacrifice or any of the things that followed you. But I can't escape it. Your choice 6 years ago is still shaping my present, still determining how people see me, still making me question if anything I accomplish is really mine or just an extension of what you did. She paused, gathering herself. I am not angry, she said. I understand why you made the choice you did. I might have made the same one. But I am tired of carrying something so heavy without any clear sense of what I am supposed to do with it. Tired of being a symbol when I just want to be a person. Tired of measuring myself against something I can never match and maybe should not have to. Footsteps approached from behind, multiple sets, measured and deliberate. Bryn did not turn around. She knew who it was before they spoke, could identify them by the rhythm of their movement and the quality of their presence. 3 people stopped a respectful distance back. She heard the subtle shift of weight that indicated they had come to attention. Then she heard the unmistakable sound of hands coming up in salute, held for 3 seconds, then lowered in unison. Still she did not turn around. The gesture was not for her benefit. It was for Lyra's. The men behind her were honoring their debt in the only way they knew how. When the footsteps retreated and she was alone again, Bryn finally turned to look. Thane, Falk, and Goran, the 3rd survivor from that day in Jalalabad, were walking away, their backs straight, their movements synchronized without apparent effort. They did not look back. They did not need to. The message had been delivered. Your mother mattered. You matter. We remember. The simplicity of it broke something loose in Bryn's chest. A tightness she had been carrying since the previous evening, finally releasing enough to let her breathe properly. She stayed at the memorial for another 20 minutes, sitting on one of the benches, watching the light change as afternoon moved toward evening. The base continued its operations around her, oblivious to her small crisis of identity and belonging. Eventually she stood and walked back toward the administrative section. There was still work to be done, reports to finish, systems to maintain. The routine would help. It always did. By the time she returned to her temporary quarters that evening, exhaustion had settled into her bones. She dropped her bag by the door, kicked off her boots, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The bracelet caught the last light coming through the window, silver flashing briefly before fading to gray. She turned her wrist to read the engraving one more time, tracing the letters with her opposite index finger. Captain Lyra Castellane, VMFA 314, KIA 03.17/2019. The same information she had read 1,000 times before, but somehow different now, weighted with context and connection. Her phone buzzed with a message. She ignored it for several seconds, then picked it up out of habit. The message was from an unknown number, but the content made the sender clear. This is Senior Chief Falk. Wanted to check in. You doing okay? Let me know if you need anything. The gesture was small but significant. He was establishing a line of communication, making it clear that support was available if she needed it. Bryn typed a brief reply. I am okay. Thank you for checking. She hesitated, then added, and thank you for what you did at the memorial. I saw. The response came back within seconds. She earned it. You do too. The conversation ended there, but the connection had been reinforced. Sleep came eventually, though it was not restful. Bryn's dreams were fragmented and intense, images of helicopters and desert compounds mixing with memories of her mother's laugh and the weight of formal notification and the sound of taps played at a funeral she had been too young to fully process. She woke multiple times, disoriented and uncomfortable, before finally giving up around 0500 and getting out of bed. The routine began again. Shower, dress, coffee, walk to the office. Another day of being known when she had spent so long trying to be invisible. The pattern continued for the rest of the week. Each day brought small variations, but the core experience remained consistent. People treated her with careful respect. Work progressed normally. Keller was nowhere to be seen, removed from her orbit entirely through mechanisms she did not fully understand and did not need to. By Friday afternoon, she had almost adjusted to the new reality, found a rhythm that felt sustainable, even if it was not what she had originally wanted. Rivera finally worked up the courage to ask directly what had happened. They were alone in the office, the other contractors having left early for the weekend. The question hung in the air, obvious and inevitable. Bryn considered deflecting again, then decided honesty might be simpler in the long run. "There was an incident in the mess hall," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "A trainee thought it would be funny to humiliate me. He did not know who I was. When people found out, they made it clear that kind of behavior was unacceptable." Rivera waited for more details, but Bryn offered nothing further. "And who are you?" Rivera asked carefully, her voice gentle but persistent. Bryn looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation, weighing how much to reveal. "I am a contractor doing logistics work," she said finally. "My mother was a Marine pilot who died in Afghanistan 6 years ago. She saved some SEALs during an extraction that went wrong. The people here remember that. That is all you need to know." The summary was clinical, stripped of emotion or detail, but it conveyed the essential facts. Rivera's expression shifted from curiosity to understanding, to something that looked like respect. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "About your mother. That must have been incredibly hard." Bryn nodded once, acknowledging the sympathy without encouraging further discussion. "It was," she said simply. Rivera seemed to understand that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "If you ever want to talk," she offered, "I am here." Bryn appreciated the gesture, even if she had no intention of accepting it. "Thank you," she said, and returned to her work. The weekend passed slowly. Bryn stayed on base, using the time to catch up on work and avoid the complications of leaving and returning. She ran in the mornings, lifted weights in the small base gym during off hours, and spent evenings reading or watching the ocean from a bench near the perimeter. The solitude was comfortable in ways that social interaction was not. She had always been someone who recharged alone, who found crowds draining rather than energizing. The events of the past week had only reinforced that tendency. On Saturday afternoon, she received a text from Thane. "A few of us are getting together tomorrow morning to remember some people. Thought you might want to join. No pressure either way." The invitation was vague, but the implication was clear. This was something related to her mother, or the memorial, or both. Bryn stared at the message for a long time, weighing whether she was ready for that kind of communal grief. Finally, she typed back, "What time and where?" The response came quickly. 0800 at the memorial. Just bring yourself. Nothing formal. Sunday morning arrived cool and overcast, fog rolling in from the ocean and settling over the base like a blanket. Bryn dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple shirt, and walked to the memorial at 0750. She arrived to find 5 people already there, standing in a loose semicircle near the wall. Tane, Falk, Gorin, and 2 others she did not recognize. They were talking quietly, their voices low and respectful. When they saw her approach, they fell silent, making space in the circle without discussion. "Thanks for coming," Thane said. "This is Bryn, for those who have not met her, Lyra's daughter." The 2 strangers nodded in greeting. One was a woman in her 40s with gray streaking her dark hair, wearing a Marine Corps sweatshirt. The other was a man perhaps in his 50s, weathered and solid, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in uniform. The woman stepped forward and extended her hand. "Captain Reyes," she said, "I flew with your mother in our first deployment. She was the best pilot I ever served with, and one of the best people I ever knew." The introduction was simple, but the emotion behind it was clear. Bryn shook her hand, overwhelmed by the sudden presence of someone who had known her mother in ways she never could. "Thank you," she managed, "for being here, for remembering her." Reyes smiled, the expression sad but genuine. "I could not forget her if I tried," she said. "None of us could." The man introduced himself as Master Chief Torin, retired now, but formerly attached to the unit that had coordinated the Jalalabad rescue. "Your mother's decision that day changed doctrine," he said bluntly. "Changed how we think about impossible missions and acceptable risk." She proved that sometimes the right choice is the one everyone else says cannot be done. They stood together in front of the memorial wall, 6 people connected by a single event and the person at its center. Tane began speaking, his voice quiet but carrying in the still morning air. "We come here every year on the anniversary," he said, looking at Bryn, March 17th. "But sometimes we come at other times too. When we need to remember, when we need to be reminded why we do what we do. Today felt like one of those times." He paused, then continued. "Each of us is going to share one memory of someone on this wall. Just something small, something that reminds us they were people, not just names." Falk went first, talking about a teammate who had died in a training accident, someone who had been known for his terrible cooking and his ability to make anyone laugh no matter how bad the situation. Goran spoke about a friend lost in Iraq, a man who had carried photos of his daughters everywhere and talked about them constantly. Reyes remembered a pilot who had died in a helicopter crash, someone who had mentored her through her first combat deployment. Torin talked about a SEAL who had been killed during a raid in Syria, a quiet professional who had never sought recognition, but had earned the respect of everyone who worked with him. When it was Tane's turn, he looked directly at Bryn. "I could talk about your mother's skill as a pilot," he said, "or her courage under fire, or the decision she made that saved 6 of us. But what I remember most is something smaller. We were waiting for extraction after a mission, sitting in this dusty compound, exhausted and hot and miserable. Your mother's helicopter was delayed for mechanical reasons. While we waited, she came over the radio and started telling jokes. Terrible jokes. The kind that make you groan more than laugh. But she kept doing it, one after another, until we were all laughing despite ourselves. Kept our spirits up during a long wait in a dangerous place. That is what I think about when I think about her. Not just the heroic moment, but all the small moments that showed who she really was. The story was so specific and human that it cut through all of Bryn's carefully maintained emotional distance. She could picture it perfectly, her mother's voice crackling over the radio, determined to make people laugh even in the middle of a war zone. "That sounds like her," Bryn said quietly. She was always trying to make things lighter somehow, make the hard parts easier to bear. Tane nodded. "That is what the best leaders do," he said. "They carry weight so others don't have to." She was exceptional at it. Then everyone looked at Bryn, waiting. She realized it was her turn to share something. The expectation was gentle but clear. She had not prepared for this, had not thought about what she might say. But standing there surrounded by people who had known her mother in ways she never could, the words came without planning. "I remember her singing," Bryn said. She had this terrible voice, but she did not care. She would sing while she cooked, or while she was getting ready for work, or while she was driving. Just these random songs from the radio or from when she was growing up. She made everything feel like it mattered less, like the world was not as serious or scary as it seemed. I did not understand until later that it was a choice, that she was choosing to be that way, even when things were hard, that it took strength, not just natural disposition. The memory had been buried under years of grief and time, but speaking it aloud brought it back with unexpected clarity. Her mother at the stove making breakfast, singing some country song completely off-key, while 11-year-old Bryn cringed in embarrassment. Her mother in the car on the way to school, drumming on the steering wheel and belting out lyrics she only half remembered. Her mother getting ready for deployment, packing her bag and humming something soft and repetitive, trying to stay calm. The images were so vivid, they felt present rather than remembered. "Thank you for sharing that," Reyes said softly. That is exactly who she was, choosing joy even when it would have been easier not to. The group stood in silence for another few minutes, each person lost in their own thoughts and memories. Then Falk spoke. "We honor them by living," he said, "by being people they would be proud to have saved or served with or known, by carrying forward the best parts of what they gave us. That is the only real memorial that matters." The gathering began to break up naturally, people saying quiet goodbyes and drifting toward their various destinations. Bryn found herself walking back toward the administrative buildings with Reyes beside her. "Can I ask you something?" Bryn said after they had covered some distance in silence. Reyes nodded. "Did my mother ever talk about being scared of dying?" Bryn asked. "About not coming home to me?" The question had been building for years, but she had never had anyone to ask who might actually know the answer. Reyes considered the question carefully. "She talked about it once," she said finally. We were having drinks after a particularly rough mission. She said the hardest part about the job was not the danger itself, but knowing that if something happened to her, you would grow up without her. She worried about that constantly, but she also said that she could not do the job halfway, could not hold back or play it safe when lives depended on her doing everything possible. So, she made peace with the risk as much as anyone can, made sure you knew she loved you, made sure there were plans in place if the worst happened. Then she went out and did the job the way it needed to be done. The answer was both comforting and painful. Her mother had been scared, had worried about leaving her daughter alone, but had chosen duty anyway, had compartmentalized that fear enough to function, had trusted that Bryn would somehow be okay. The knowledge settled into Bryn like a stone dropping into deep water, creating ripples she would feel for a long time. "Thank you for telling me," she said. It helps to know she thought about it, that she did not just throw her life away without considering what it would cost. She never threw anything away, Reyes said, firmly. Every decision she made was calculated and intentional. She knew the stakes, and she chose to pay them because she believed in the mission and the people she was trying to save. That is not carelessness. That is courage of the highest order. They reached the point where their paths diverged. Reyes turned to face Bryn fully. "You are welcome to reach out any time," she said. "I live in San Diego now, retired from active duty but still connected to the community. If you ever want to talk about your mother or just need someone who understands this world, I am available." Bryn nodded, genuinely grateful for the offer. "Thank you," she said. "I might take you up on that." Reyes smiled and walked away, leaving Bryn standing alone in the morning light. The fog was beginning to burn off, patches of blue appearing through the gray. The base was coming to life around her, the weekend quiet giving way to the beginning of another work week. She stood there for another minute, gathering herself, then continued toward her quarters. The following week brought a new rhythm. Bryn was no longer fighting to be invisible, but she was also not leaning into visibility. She did her work with the same competence she always had, interacted professionally with everyone who needed her attention, and maintained appropriate boundaries. People seemed to settle into a pattern of respectful distance, acknowledging her without making her the center of attention. It was not the anonymity she had originally sought, but it was manageable. On Tuesday, a new contractor arrived. Her name was Joss, and she was 24, fresh out of college, nervous and eager to prove herself. She had been assigned to the logistics office, and Rivera took primary responsibility for her training. But Joss gravitated toward Bryn's desk whenever possible, perhaps sensing that Bryn's quiet competence was something worth studying. Bryn tolerated the attention with more patience than she expected from herself, answering questions and offering guidance when asked. "Can I ask you something?" Joss said one afternoon during a rare lull in activity. Bryn looked up from her screen, expression neutral but not unwelcoming. "You can ask," she said. "Whether I answer is a different question." Joss smiled nervously. "How do you deal with being," she paused, searching for the right word, "ignored here? Like, I have been here 3 days and I feel invisible. Does it get easier?" The question hit closer to home than Joss could possibly know. Bryn considered her response carefully. "They don't ignore you," she said finally. "They see you when it matters. The trick is doing your job well enough that when they need you, you are ready. Everything else is just noise. Focus on being good at what you do. The respect follows competence, not the other way around." The advice was practical and earned from experience. Joss seemed to absorb it, nodding thoughtfully. "You seem really confident," Joss observed, "like nothing gets to you." "How long did it take to get like that?" Bryn almost laughed at the assessment. "I am not confident," she said. "I just learned to function through uncertainty. There is a difference. Confidence means you know what is going to happen. Functioning through uncertainty means you keep moving forward even when you have no idea what comes next. That is a skill you develop over time, usually through not having any other choice." The explanation seemed to resonate with Joss. She returned to her desk, looking slightly less anxious than before. Over the following days, she continued to seek out Bryn's guidance, asking questions about systems and procedures, but also about how to navigate the complex social environment of the base. Bryn found herself offering more advice than she had anticipated, drawing on her own recent experiences to help someone even newer and more uncertain than herself. The role reversal was strange, but not unwelcome. Helping someone else made her own situation feel slightly less overwhelming. 2 weeks after the incident, Bryn was walking back from a meeting with the supply sergeant when she passed a group of SEAL trainees doing conditioning exercises near the obstacle course. She recognized Parch among them, his face red from exertion, but his form solid. He saw her and nodded slightly without breaking stride. She nodded back, the acknowledgement brief and professional. Keller was not with the group. She did not ask where he was, and no one volunteered the information. His absence was its own answer. Some consequences played out slowly, but inevitably, like erosion or rust, invisible until the damage was already done. That evening, Bryn returned to the memorial. It was becoming a habit, this weekly visit, to stand in front of her mother's name and try to make sense of legacy and obligation and the weight of being someone's daughter when that someone had been extraordinary. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the polished stone. She read the name as she always did, touched the bracelet as she always did, stood in silence as she always did. But this time, when she closed her eyes, she felt something shift internally, a small adjustment in how she carried the weight. Her mother had not asked to be a hero. She had been a pilot doing her job in impossible circumstances, making a choice in real time because it was the right thing to do even when the cost was ultimate. Bryn had spent years trying not to be defined by that choice, by that sacrifice, by the heroism she had not inherited and could never equal. But maybe that had been the wrong framework. Maybe the point was not to match what Lyra had done, but to honor it by living honestly and working hard and being someone who could be trusted when trust mattered. She opened her eyes and looked at the engraving one more time. Captain Lyra Castellane, VMFA 314, KIA 0317 2019. The letters were just letters, inert and permanent, but behind them was a person who had loved fiercely and laughed easily, and flown into a kill zone because 6 men she did not know needed someone willing to risk everything. That person had given Bryn life, and then given her life to save others. The debt was unpayable, but the acknowledgement was necessary. "I see you," Bryn whispered to the stone. "I know what you did. I will try to make it mean something." The base settled into evening operations around her. Helicopters returned from training exercises, their rotors beating steady rhythms into the darkening sky. Trucks rolled past carrying equipment and personnel. The ambient noise of military efficiency continued unabated, indifferent to individual struggles or small moments of understanding. Bryn stood a little longer, then turned and walked back toward the administrative buildings. Tomorrow would bring more work, more small interactions weighted with knowledge she had not asked people to have, more navigation of expectations and protocols she was still learning. But she would face it the way ospreys faced everything, by adapting, by surviving, by finding a way forward even when the path was not clear. The logistics office was dark when she passed it, everyone gone for the evening. She continued to her quarters, climbed the stairs, unlocked her door. The room was small and temporary, nothing personalized beyond the canvas bag in the corner and the uniform arrangement of essentials. She had not bothered to make it comfortable because she had not planned to stay beyond the contracted period. Now she wondered if that would change, if this temporary assignment might become something more permanent, because she had found something here she had not expected. Not family exactly, but connection. Not home, but recognition. She sat on the edge of the bed and removed the bracelet for the first time in days. The silver was warm from her body heat, molded slightly to the shape of her wrist. She held it in her palm and felt its weight, lighter than it seemed when she was wearing it. The engraving caught the light from the single lamp, letters standing out briefly before fading back into smooth metal. She had inherited this object without choice, carried it without fully understanding what it meant, and now found herself unable to imagine taking it off. It was burden and comfort simultaneously, reminder and talisman, connection to someone she barely remembered but could never forget. In the morning, she would put it back on and return to work. She would answer questions from Joss and coordinate shipments and process requisitions, and do all the small essential tasks that kept the base functioning. She would interact with SEALs who knew who she was and civilians who did not, maintaining professional boundaries while navigating the complex social structures she had not fully understood until they had risen up around her. She would be competent and reliable and occasionally invisible again, because invisibility was still useful even if it could never be complete. But tonight she let herself sit with the bracelet in her hand and think about her mother, about the choice Lyra had made in a moment of crisis, the calculation that said these lives matter more than my own, about the 11-year-old girl who had lost everything when two Marines knocked on her door, about the 28-year-old woman who had tried to build a life separate from heroism and sacrifice and found herself pulled back into orbit around both. The story was not over. It would never really be over. But maybe that was acceptable. Maybe legacy was not something you escaped, but something you learned to carry with grace. The base outside her window continued its eternal rhythm. Guard shifts changing, training happening in darkness, operations planned and executed and evaluated. The machinery of military readiness grinding forward without pause or reflection. Bryn was a small part of that machinery now, essential in aggregate if not individually, contributing to something larger than herself in ways both visible and invisible. Her mother had done the same in a different uniform, with different skills. The specifics varied, but the core remained constant. Service meant showing up. It meant doing the work. It meant being someone others could count on when counting mattered. She set the bracelet on the small table beside her bed, close enough to reach if she woke disoriented in the night. The silver gleamed briefly in the lamplight before she turned off the switch, plunging the room into darkness. Outside, the stars were emerging, pinpricks of light against the vast California sky. Somewhere helicopters were flying, practicing maneuvers or conducting operations or simply moving from one place to another. Somewhere people were making choices that would ripple forward into consequences they could not predict. Somewhere, a mother's sacrifice was still saving lives 6 years after her death, not through direct action, but through the network of loyalty and debt and honor it had created. Bryn closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her under. Tomorrow would come with its challenges and complications. Tonight she could rest, knowing that she was seen, she was valued, and she carried something worth protecting. The invisible woman had become visible not through her own choice, but through the choices of others. What she did with that visibility would define the next chapter. But for now, sleep was enough. For now, survival was enough. For now, she was exactly where her mother had named her to be. An osprey, adapting, enduring, finding her way forward one day at a time. 3 weeks after the incident in the mess hall, Bryn received word that her temporary contract had been extended. The notification came through official channels, a simple email from Human Resources outlining the new terms and duration. 6 more months, with possibility of permanent placement if performance remained satisfactory. She stared at the email for a long time, weighing whether this was what she wanted. The decision should have been straightforward. The work was good, the pay was fair, and she had developed competence in systems that would take someone else months to learn. But accepting meant committing to being known, to carrying her mother's legacy in proximity to people who would never let her forget it. She thought about the memorial and the conversations with Thane and the small moments of connection that had surprised her. She thought about Joss looking to her for guidance and the way Falk had checked in without being intrusive. She thought about her mother's voice crackling over the radio, telling jokes in a war zone because keeping spirits up mattered. She thought about ospreys and adaptation and survival. Then she hit reply and typed 3 words. I accept. Thanks. The decision was made before she fully understood why she was making it. Sometimes the path forward became clear only by taking the next step. The story of sacrifice does not end with the person who makes it. It continues in the lives they touch, the debts they create, the standards they set. Captain Lyra Castellane had been gone for 6 years, but her impact remained, carried forward by the men she saved and the daughter she left behind. That was the true measure of heroism. Not the moment of action, but the echoes that followed, rippling outward in ways both seen and unseen, shaping reality long after the hero had fallen. Bryn understood that now. She had become part of the echo, willingly or not, and maybe, in time, she would find a way to be grateful for it. The weeks turned into months. Summer came to Coronado, bringing heat that made the concrete shimmer and turned the Pacific into a sheet of hammered silver. Bryn settled into rhythms that felt increasingly sustainable. Work, meals, occasional conversations with people who had become something like friends. She went running in the early mornings when the air was still cool. She visited the memorial every Sunday, sometimes alone, sometimes finding others there who nodded in acknowledgement. She wore the bracelet every day, and it stopped feeling like a weight she carried and became instead just part of who she was. Joss grew more confident under her guidance, eventually taking on responsibilities that freed Bryn to focus on more complex logistics challenges. They developed an easy working relationship built on mutual respect and complementary skills. Rivera stopped trying to draw Bryn into social activities outside work, but became a reliable colleague inside it. The office functioned smoothly, a small ecosystem of competence and professionalism that Bryn took quiet pride in maintaining. She saw Keller once, from a distance, looking thin and exhausted in a way that suggested his path through training had become exactly as difficult as Falk had predicted. He did not see her. She did not try to make herself seen. His consequences were his own to carry. She had enough weight without taking on his as well. Parch graduated and was assigned to a team on the East Coast. Landis and Quaid were still in training, their association with Keller apparently not enough to destroy their careers, but enough to make them work harder to prove themselves. The machinery of consequence and redemption ground forward with impersonal efficiency. One evening in late August, Bryn was working late when Thane appeared in the office doorway. He waited until she noticed him, then gestured toward the hallway. She saved her work and followed him outside. They walked in silence until they reached the bench near the perimeter, where the ocean was visible in the distance. "Want to sit?" he asked. She nodded, and they settled onto the weathered wood, watching the last light fade from the western sky. "I wanted to tell you something," Thane said after a few minutes. "The anniversary is coming up. March 17th is still months away, but we are planning the gathering now, making sure everyone who wants to be there can arrange leave or travel. We would like you to speak this year. Just a few words about your mother, about who she was beyond the pilot and the hero, about the person only you really knew." The request was unexpected and immediate anxiety tightened in Bryn's chest. "I don't know if I can do that," she said quietly. "Stand in front of people and talk about her. Put into words something that still hurts to think about." Thane nodded, accepting her hesitation without judgment. "I understand," he said, "but I also think you would regret not doing it. Those men she saved deserve to hear from you, and you deserve to be part of how she is remembered. Not as a footnote or a symbol, but as her daughter, speaking her truth about who Lyra Castellane actually was. Think about it. You have time, but I hope you will say yes." The conversation shifted to other topics, but the request stayed with Bryn long after Thane had left. She thought about it during her runs, during quiet moments at work, during her Sunday visits to the memorial. The idea terrified her, but it also felt necessary, a step she needed to take to fully integrate this new identity she was building. She was Lyra Castellane's daughter. She wore that legacy every day in the form of a silver bracelet and the respect of people who owed debts they could never fully repay. Maybe it was time to claim that identity actively, rather than just accepting it passively. 2 weeks before the deadline Thane had given her to decide, Bryn sent him a text. "I will speak, but I need help writing it. I don't know how to say what needs to be said." The response came within minutes. "Come by my office tomorrow at 1500. We will work on it together." The collaboration that followed was intense and emotional, Thane asking questions that forced Bryn to excavate memories she had buried, to articulate feelings she had never fully processed. But slowly, over multiple sessions, something resembling a speech took shape. Not perfect, but honest. Not comprehensive but true. The autumn turned toward winter. Bryn's contract was converted to permanent status without fanfare or celebration. She signed the paperwork and continued working as if nothing had changed, though internally something had shifted. This was no longer temporary. This was her life now, for better or worse, carrying her mother's legacy in a place that would never let her forget it, but also would never let her face it alone. She could live with that. More than that, she could build something meaningful around it. Christmas came, and she flew to see her grandparents, spending a week in the house where she had grown up after her mother died. They were older now, slowing down in ways that made Bryn aware of how little time remained. She told them about the base and the work and the people she had met. She did not tell them about Keller or the mess hall or the moment when invisibility had been stripped away. Some things were too complicated to explain to people who had not lived them, but she showed them photos of the memorial and told them about the yearly gathering. They cried as she had known they would, but they also smiled. "Your mother would be so proud," her grandmother said. "You found your way to her even though she is gone. That takes courage." Winter in Coronado was mild, temperatures dropping only slightly, rain occasional but never overwhelming. Bryn ran in the mornings regardless of weather, finding clarity in the repetition of movement and breath. The speech was written and rewritten, refined until every word felt essential. She practiced it alone in her room, speaking to empty air, trying to make her voice steady and her emotions manageable. Tane listened to a draft and offered suggestions that made it stronger. By the time March arrived, she was as ready as she would ever be. The anniversary gathering was larger than she expected. More than 50 people assembled at the memorial on the morning of March the 17th. A mix of active duty SEALs, retired operators, Marine aviators, and families of the fallen. The weather was perfect, clear and cool with light wind. Someone had placed flowers at the base of the wall near Lyra's name. Bryn stood at the edge of the crowd, nervous but committed, waiting for her turn to speak. Falk opened the ceremony with brief remarks about the importance of remembering sacrifice and honoring those who gave everything. Reyes spoke about Lyra's skill as a pilot and her dedication to her crew. Goran recounted the events of that day in Jalalabad, his voice steady but emotional. Then Thane introduced Bryn, his words simple but weighted with meaning. Lyra's daughter would like to share a few thoughts about the woman behind the uniform. "Please welcome Bryn Castellane." She walked to the front of the assembled group, her hands shaking slightly but her voice surprisingly steady when she began to speak. "My mother was a hero," she said, "but she was also a person. She burned toast almost every morning and sang off-key in the shower. She told terrible jokes that made me cringe, and she laughed at her own punchlines before anyone else could. She worried about paying bills and whether I was eating enough vegetables, and if she was doing a good enough job raising me alone. She was brave and skilled and dedicated to her mission. But she was also human, flawed and funny, and sometimes scared." The words came easier than she expected, years of bottled emotion finding release through carefully chosen language. "I did not understand for a long time why she made the choice she did that day," Bryn continued. "It seemed like she threw away her life without thinking about what it would cost me. But I understand now that she did think about it. She knew exactly what she was risking, and she chose to pay that price because 6 men needed someone willing to do the impossible. That is not carelessness. That is the highest form of love. Loving strangers enough to die for them. Loving your principles enough to act on them regardless of cost." She paused, looking out at the faces watching her. Some were crying openly. Others had their jaws clenched tight, fighting emotion. All of them were present in a way that felt sacred. "I carry her legacy every day," Bryn said, gesturing to the bracelet on her wrist. "Not as a burden, but as a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. My mother was ordinary in most ways. She just happened to be in a position where extraordinary action was required, and she chose to rise to that moment. I hope I can do the same if I ever face a similar choice. I hope all of us can. That is how we honor her. Not by worshiping her sacrifice, but by being worthy of it." The speech ended, and for a moment, there was absolute silence. Then someone started clapping, and the entire group joined in, applause building until it felt like thunder. Bryn stepped back, overwhelmed, and Thane was there immediately, his hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "You did good," he said quietly. "She did good raising you." The words broke something open in Bryn, and she let herself cry for the first time in front of these people, tears streaming down her face, while Thane stood beside her, a silent presence offering support without demanding anything in return. The gathering continued for another hour, people sharing memories and telling stories and simply being present together. Bryn found herself approached by multiple people who thanked her for speaking, who told her they had known her mother, who offered connection if she ever needed it. The network of care and obligation that had seemed overwhelming months ago now felt sustaining, a web of relationships that would catch her if she fell. She was not alone in carrying this legacy. She never had been. It had just taken time to see it. As the crowd dispersed, Bryn remained at the memorial, standing in front of her mother's name one more time. The bracelet caught the midday sun, silver bright and warm against her skin. She touched it once, a gesture that had become automatic over months of repetition, then placed her palm flat against the stone. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything you gave me, for the choice you made, for naming me Osprey and trusting I would figure out what that meant. I am still learning, but I am trying. I hope that is enough. The base continued around her, indifferent and eternal. Helicopters lifted off in the distance, their rotors beating the air into submission. Somewhere people were training and working and living and dying. Somewhere choices were being made that would ripple forward into consequences decades from now. Somewhere, a young woman was learning to carry a legacy she had not asked for, but was beginning to understand. The story was not finished. It never would be. But she was writing her chapter now, word by word, choice by choice, day by ordinary day. If you have ever known someone who sacrificed quietly, who served without seeking recognition, take a moment to honor their memory today. Share their story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you found meaning in this story, I would be grateful if you would subscribe and join us in remembering that the greatest acts of courage are often the ones we never see coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering with us.